Lydia Monroe was 13 years old when her mother dropped her off for a sleepover that should have been like any other. It was early spring, March of 2018, the kind of chilly Friday where parents lingered in their cars a few seconds longer before pulling away. Lydia wore her favorite navy hoodie, the one with the thumb holes she liked, and carried a small duffel bag packed with a change of clothes, her phone charger, and a wrapped Lego set for Abby's little brother's birthday. Her mother would later describe Lydia as in a good mood, maybe a little quiet, but not in a way that raised concern. It wasn't the first time Lydia had stayed overnight at Abby's house. They'd been inseparable since 5th grade, neighbors, classmates, sometimes even mistaken for sisters when they were out together. Their families weren't close, not in the sense of holiday dinners or shared vacations, but friendly enough that Lydia's mom didn't feel the need to walk her to the door that night. She watched her daughter wave, walk up the drive, and disappear into the porch light. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Abby's house sat 2 cul-de-sacs over from the Monroes, close enough that Lydia could have walked home in under 10 minutes if she wanted to. It was a beige 2-story with dark green shutters and a detached garage converted into a game room. Inside were bunk beds, Abby's hamster tank, a TV playing cartoons in the background, and the usual chaos of a suburban household with 3 kids under 15. Lydia joined them for frozen pizza, a shortcake celebration for Abby's brother, and later popcorn and a movie in the basement. According to Abby, they stayed up playing games on their phones, made TikToks, and laughed until almost 11:30 p.m. That's when she said Lydia got tired and decided to go to sleep on the couch. Abby claimed she went upstairs after that and didn't wake up until the next morning. It was around 7:50 a.m. when Abby's mother realized Lydia wasn't in the house. She'd gone downstairs expecting to find the girls groggy and scrolling their phones, only to find the basement empty. At first, she assumed Lydia had woken up early and walked home, maybe upset or homesick. She texted Lydia's mom just after 8:10 a.m., asking, "Hey, did Lydia head home early this morning?" The reply came almost instantly. No, she hadn't. The confusion quickly turned to panic. Lydia's mom tried calling her daughter's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She drove the 8 blocks in under 3 minutes and arrived to find Abby's mother standing barefoot in the driveway, scanning the sidewalks with her arms folded tight across her chest. Inside, Abby was still upstairs, claiming she had no idea Lydia had even left. By 9:20 a.m., Lydia Monroe was officially reported missing. The police arrived not long after, and their initial sweep of the house turned up no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows. Her overnight bag was still tucked behind the basement couch, untouched. Her shoes were by the door. Her phone, however, was missing. Abby said Lydia had it when they went to bed, but no one saw her use it after 11 p.m. That night, the police issued a local alert. They described her as 5'2", 105 pounds, with shoulder-length light brown hair, last seen wearing blue pajama pants and a faded hoodie. Neighbors joined in, checking backyards, tool sheds, anywhere a teenager might hide if she'd run off or gotten lost in the early morning cold. But something didn't feel right. Lydia wasn't the type to leave without saying anything. She was shy, not impulsive. Her mother insisted she had no reason to run away, no fights at home, no signs of distress. She was excited about her upcoming science fair project and had made weekend plans to see her grandmother. In interviews, her mother repeatedly said the same thing. She would have texted me. Even if she got scared, even if she made a mistake, she would have reached out. But no messages ever came. Her phone never pinged another tower after midnight. There were no surveillance cameras on Abbey Street and no witnesses who saw Lydia leave. According to every timeline the police reconstructed, Lydia Monroe simply vanished sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 7 a.m. in a home she was comfortable in, surrounded by people who knew her. Abby's parents cooperated at first, allowing officers to look through the basement, the backyard, even the garage. But when asked about security cameras, they claimed their home had none installed, despite a blank plastic mount still visible near the back door. When asked about their sleep habits, Abby's father said he fell asleep watching TV in the living room and never heard a thing. It was all too neat, too quiet. But without physical evidence, the police couldn't do more than file their notes and hope something turned up. Volunteers printed flyers. A local radio station played Lydia's favorite song, hoping she might hear it. But the first weekend ended in silence. By Monday, the town had already begun to shift its focus, speculating online, dissecting theories, drawing invisible lines between the Monroe family and Abby's. Some believed Lydia had left the house on her own. Others questioned why Abby's story felt so carefully rehearsed. But there were no footprints in the yard, no fingerprints on the windows, no sounds reported in the night. Lydia had vanished without a trace, and no one, not even those in the house, could explain how. The second time officers entered Abby's house, it wasn't with soft voices and hopeful questions. It was with notepads, tape measures, and the quiet suspicion that something didn't add up. The first officers on scene had done their job, looked for signs of forced entry, interviewed everyone present, gathered timelines. But as the hours stretched into days and no trace of Lydia Monroe surfaced, the tone changed. The house at 142 Redwood Lane became more than just the last place Lydia had been seen. It became the center of a growing puzzle with too many clean corners. Abby's parents, Mike and Rachel Caldwell, stood by their version of events. They had hosted a small birthday party for their son, cleaned up by 10, and had assumed the girls were asleep shortly after. They claimed no one heard anything unusual and nothing was out of place by morning. Their daughter, Abby, pale but composed, repeated the same statement. She and Lydia watched videos on her phone, talked about school, and both drifted off around 11 p.m. She said she woke up late, noticed Lydia wasn't there, and figured she'd gone home early. No stuttering, no confusion, just a straight line of calm memory. But it was the calmness that unsettled people. Investigators noted how Abby rarely asked questions about Lydia's disappearance. She didn't cry during the interviews. She didn't seem worried. Her mother chalked it up to shock. Her father became defensive, saying, "She's a quiet kid. This is just how she processes things." But behind closed doors, the detectives weren't so sure. They requested a full walkthrough of the property, and this time they documented everything: the positioning of the furniture, the locks on the doors, the visibility of the yard from each window. And it was the basement that caught their attention first. The room where Lydia had supposedly slept was half finished. Exposed cement floors, a sectional couch, a dusty bookshelf with a TV on top, and a space heater plugged into a nearby socket. Lydia's overnight bag still sat, zipped, untouched. Her shoes were at the base of the stairs, her hoodie folded over the armrest. There was no indication she'd packed up or prepared to leave. But there was one thing that stood out: a side door near the laundry area that led into a narrow staircase up to the backyard. According to the Caldwells, this door was old and jammed most of the time, and it had been locked that night. But when officers tested it, it clicked open with a simple twist of the knob. The latch was misaligned. One officer later noted in his report that the locking mechanism was loose enough that a child could force it open with steady pressure. If Lydia had used that door, she could have slipped into the yard unnoticed. But there were no footprints, no soil disturbed, no trail to follow. Over the next 72 hours, the house became the center of a slow-building storm. Teams of investigators returned repeatedly, each time digging a little deeper. They opened every cabinet, checked behind large furniture, and even scanned the walls for hidden panels or crawl spaces. The Caldwells allowed it all, at least at first. But by day 3, they were growing irritated. Mike Caldwell began pushing back, asking if they were being treated as suspects. He stopped answering calls directly, instead filtering communication through a family friend who happened to be an attorney. Abby, meanwhile, remained mostly in her room. When officers tried to re-interview her on day 4, she declined. Her mother said she was too overwhelmed. Rumors quickly began spreading beyond the front door. Neighbors whispered that the Caldwells were hiding something. A local journalist started probing into their family background, digging up an old civil complaint against Mike Caldwell from years prior, involving an inappropriate interaction at a former workplace. It had been dismissed, never criminally pursued, but the damage to perception was already done. Online message boards filled with speculation. Some insisted Lydia had snuck out and met someone, an older boy, a friend's brother, someone she'd been messaging secretly. Others were convinced Abby knew more than she was saying. Every detail from that night was dissected and turned over until even basic facts became suspect. Why hadn't the dog barked? Why was Lydia's phone missing but her bag untouched? Why did Abby describe Lydia's last words so precisely, almost like a script? Behind the scenes, investigators started creating a map of the house, noting every window, door, hallway, and blind spot. They walked the basement multiple times, noting how sound traveled, how long it took to walk from one end of the house to the other, how easy it would be to exit quietly. The side door, though not broken, was now considered a point of concern. It didn't require a key to exit. The latch didn't hold. It faced away from the street, hidden by overgrown hedges. The Caldwells claimed it had been secured that night, but there was no evidence to prove or disprove that. No cameras, no alarm system, no one who saw it locked, just a statement the police couldn't confirm but also couldn't challenge. Yet, at this point, the case teetered. There were no fingerprints, no fibers, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Lydia had simply vanished between the folds of memory and drywall. But law enforcement had been here before. Sometimes houses kept secrets longer than people did. Sometimes the structure itself held answers that no one wanted to face. The basement was marked for future inspection with ground-penetrating radar, a protocol used when all other leads run dry. But for now, it was just a room where a 13-year-old girl had supposedly gone to sleep and never woken up. And it was only the beginning. By the fourth day of Lydia Monroe's disappearance, the local police department brought in K-9 units from 2 neighboring counties. Search and rescue teams arrived with thermal drones, scent articles, and scent detection dogs trained to track human odor across rough terrain. The wooded area behind the Caldwells' cul-de-sac wasn't large, just a cluster of scrub pine, bare trees, and a shallow drainage ditch that curved behind 4 homes. Still, it was the only stretch of land unlit and unmonitored, and it was enough to create doubt. The dogs began their work shortly after dawn. They were given Lydia's pillowcase and her favorite hoodie, items taken from her bedroom. One dog caught a scent almost immediately, pulling hard across the lawn, past the Caldwells' back fence and toward the narrow gap between properties where a section of the old wood had warped inward. It was just wide enough for a child to slip through. Officers followed as the dog darted into the trees, tail stiff, breathing fast. For about 40 yards, the trail held strong. But then, near the edge of a muddy embankment, the dog slowed, sniffed, circled, and stopped. Whatever scent had been there ended abruptly. They brought in a second dog. It followed the same path, stopped in the same place. Handlers noted no clear indication of distress, no blood, no trace evidence, no drag marks, just nothing. The scent stopped as if Lydia had been lifted from the ground entirely. Theories began forming immediately. A vehicle parked just beyond the trees, an abduction by someone lying in wait, a mistake in the dog's tracking. Officers searched the area for tire marks but found none. The soil was hard-packed, dry from an unusually warm spring. If someone had taken her from that spot, they'd left no trace doing it. The neighbors were next. Officers knocked on every door within 4 blocks, asking for statements, checking ring cameras, requesting access to backyard footage. Most complied. 2 homes had partial views of the Caldwell backyard, one facing their driveway, the other with an angle toward the fence. Neither had captured anything relevant. No movement past 10 p.m., no shadowy figures, no signs of Lydia leaving or anyone entering. Still, detectives asked residents to keep footage saved, hoping something small might surface later. Headlights, motion triggers, a porch light flicker. But by the end of the 5th day, the digital trail was just as cold as the physical one. Online discussion grew louder. A Facebook group titled Find Lydia Monroe had reached nearly 3,000 members in less than a week. Theories flourished, some rooted in genuine concern, others spinning into conspiracy. Posts dissected Abby's body language and photos, questioned the Caldwells' lack of emotion, and even analyzed Rachel Caldwell's tone during a brief, uncomfortable local news interview. But it was what happened on day 6 that shifted public opinion sharply. The Caldwells retained legal counsel. A defense attorney known for handling high-profile regional cases released a brief statement to the press. "My clients are cooperating fully with the investigation. They are not suspects. They are grieving alongside the Monroe family. The move was legal, but it was also a message, and it landed poorly. Lydia's mother was blindsided. She hadn't even hired an attorney herself yet. To the public, it looked like guilt. To detectives, it looked like someone was preparing for accusations that hadn't been made yet. Internally, the department struggled with how to move forward. There was no body, no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence pointing to a crime. But there was also no sign of a runaway, no pattern of behavior suggesting Lydia had planned to leave, no texts, no notes, no online searches for escape. When Lydia's phone records came back, they revealed a final ping at 11:41 p.m. from the Caldwell's Wi-Fi network. After that, radio silence. Her device had either been turned off or destroyed. The search team reviewed her school Chromebook, browser history, and social media messages. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave, meet someone, or run away. As protocol dictated, Lydia's family came under review as well. Her older brother, Dylan, was questioned. He'd been at home that night, playing online games with friends. Investigators checked server logs and phone metadata to confirm his alibi. He cooperated, provided passwords, and allowed his room to be searched. Nothing emerged. Lydia's father, who lived in another state and hadn't seen her in over a year, was briefly contacted and cleared. The Monroe home was scoured from attic to crawl space. Everything came up clean. And yet the sense of something hidden continued to cling to the investigation. The Caldwells weren't being charged, but their behavior grew more guarded. They declined additional interviews. Abby stopped attending school and was placed on temporary medical leave for emotional exhaustion. Police applied for a secondary warrant to search the Caldwell residence more thoroughly, but without new evidence or probable cause, it was denied. The house remained untouched, and whatever secrets it held remained buried. By the end of the first week, the flyers began to curl in the wind. The command tent at the edge of the woods was taken down. The media shifted to other headlines. Lydia's mother kept her porch light on every night. She refused to touch her daughter's room. She answered every phone call that came through, even wrong numbers. And somewhere in a neighborhood that had been picked over by officers, scanned by dogs, and haunted by silence, the question remained: how does a girl disappear so completely? And why does the place where it happened still feel so intact? It was early September, 5 months to the day since Lydia Monroe vanished, when her mother decided to finally clean the bedroom they had left untouched since that morning. The clothes on her chair, the science project on her desk, the untouched journal still open to April 2nd, they all remained where Lydia had left them. Her mother moved slowly, as if touching any object might erase the last part of her daughter that still felt close. She wasn't looking for clues anymore. That stage had passed. Now it was about trying to find a way to live inside a home that still echoed her daughter's absence. But when she shifted the tall, narrow dresser to vacuum beneath it, something unexpected fell from the back panel: a soft cover composition notebook with duct tape on the spine. Lydia's name wasn't written on it, but the handwriting was hers. The diary wasn't structured. It was a collection of quick thoughts, emotional scribbles, sometimes just phrases or one-line rants about school, friends, or how she hated gym class. Her mother flipped through it with the casual heartbreak of someone looking for comfort, until one entry made her stop cold. Dated just 2 weeks before the sleepover, it read, "Sometimes I feel like Abby's dad watches me. Not in a normal way. Just when I'm not looking. I caught him once and he smiled but didn't say anything. I didn't tell Abby because I don't want to mess things up." That night, Lydia's mother sat at the kitchen table and read it again, this time under a brighter light, checking the margins, looking for context. There were a few similar notes scattered across earlier pages, nothing explicit. Nothing direct, but always the same unease. He makes jokes that aren't funny. He sat too close on the couch again. I'm not going in the basement alone anymore. The next morning, Lydia's mother drove straight to the police department with the notebook. The lead investigator, who had since moved on to another case, reopened Lydia's file. The language wasn't criminal, but it was enough to justify re-examining prior assumptions. The Caldwells had cooperated initially, But there had always been tension, an undertone the officers couldn't name. With the diary now part of the case record, the department filed for a new search warrant on the Caldwell residence, this time citing specific concern about Mike Caldwell's behavior. When investigators returned to the house, they approached quietly. No press, no public notice. The Caldwells were not informed until officers were at their door with paperwork in hand. Rachel Caldwell objected. Mike appeared disoriented, asking repeatedly if this was some kind of mistake. Abby wasn't home. She had been sent to live temporarily with her aunt out of state for mental health support, though investigators suspected it was more about distance than therapy. The officers were careful, methodical. They examined every room again, including closets, attics, crawl spaces. They paid special attention to the basement, which had remained largely unchanged. But this time, they noted something they hadn't inspected closely the first time, a deep chest-style freezer tucked into the far corner behind stacked laundry bins. The freezer was unplugged. It was locked. When asked for the key, Rachel hesitated. Mike stepped in and provided it without comment. Inside, the freezer was empty. Clean, dry, no visible stains, nothing stored inside. But a detective noticed something else. The interior rubber seal showed signs of being compressed in places, as if the lid had been forced shut multiple times with resistance. There were faint scratch marks inside the metal lining, inconsistent with normal food storage. A sample swab was taken, but no immediate biological evidence was found. Still, the freezer was cataloged, photographed, and documented in the renewed case file. A technician later confirmed that the model was capable of maintaining sub-zero temperatures for extended periods without much power. If someone had used it for concealment, even temporarily, it would have left minimal forensic trace, especially if it had been thoroughly cleaned. Investigators asked about its use. Mike Caldwell said it had once been used for bulk frozen food, but had been unplugged since the spring. He couldn't recall the exact date. The vague timeline triggered further questions. Receipts were requested. The appliance had no registered serial number, and no purchase record could be found in the Caldwell's bank statements. It wasn't definitive, but it was troubling. During this second search, one officer discovered something else in a cardboard box near the water heater, a porcelain doll. Dressed in a faded blue dress, missing one eye. It had been placed upright inside a shoebox packed between rolls of holiday wrapping paper. The doll had no direct connection to Lydia. It was dusty, clearly aged, and when asked, Mike claimed it belonged to his mother and had been in the house since forever. But when police cross-referenced old birthday party photos of Abby's younger brother, the doll was never visible in any corner of the basement where it now sat. Its sudden appearance in an organized box, packed so deliberately, raised quiet questions. It didn't prove anything, but to some investigators, it confirmed a pattern, that things in the Caldwell house moved when people weren't looking. Still, with no new physical evidence, no confessions, and no direct witness statements, the renewed investigation stalled once again. The diary was real. The discomfort Lydia felt was undeniable. But discomfort wasn't a crime. The search warrant expired. The Caldwells weren't charged. The public was never told what the officers found in that unplugged freezer. But inside the department, something shifted. The case file was quietly reclassified as a potential homicide. From that point forward, Lydia Monroe was no longer listed in the system as a missing child. She was listed as presumed deceased. And still, there was no proof. Just a diary, a locked freezer, a doll with one missing eye, and a basement that kept more questions than answers. 2 years after Lydia Monroe vanished without a trace, the Caldwell house went up for sale. No public announcement, no farewell. A moving truck arrived just after sunrise on a Tuesday in early spring, and by nightfall, the windows were dark, the blinds drawn, the lock changed. The for sale sign had already been placed days earlier. But neighbors said it felt like they left in the middle of the night. By then, the whispers were louder than any official report. Abby's family cited harassment, paranoia, and years of online suspicion as the reasons for their departure. In their statement, issued through their attorney, they said the neighborhood had become unlivable and that the constant suspicion had taken a toll on their mental health. "We've cooperated in every way," the letter read. "We deserve peace." But not everyone agreed. Most families on Redwood Lane stayed quiet, choosing avoidance over confrontation. A few said the Caldwells were victims of a rumor spiral. Others weren't so sure. Abby had never returned to school after the first year. She was reportedly being homeschooled and had all but vanished from social media. Her father rarely came out front anymore, and her mother, once active in the PTA, had stopped attending events entirely. By the time the moving truck pulled away, the remaining families kept their curtains drawn and didn't wave goodbye. No one came out to help. Meanwhile, 2 houses down, Lydia's bedroom remained untouched. Her mother couldn't bring herself to box anything. The bed stayed made, her backpack hung from the corner of her chair, and the glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the ceiling above her pillow. On the wall, a printed flyer with her photo, creased from tape, corners curled, remained taped beside her light switch. Her parents never left the neighborhood. They didn't repaint the house or change the front porch light. Every anniversary, they hosted a candlelight vigil in the cul-de-sac. Dozens showed up the first year, fewer the second. By the third, it was mostly family and the one retired detective who refused to let the case fade. Detective Harold Grayson had been 2 years from retirement when Lydia disappeared. After stepping down, he continued to review the case in his own time. He visited the Monroe house every few months, sometimes just to sit with Lydia's mother and talk. He believed the answer was in that house, that something had been missed. "The house didn't lie," he once told a local reporter. "It just never finished telling the truth." In private conversations, he said he had pushed for ground-penetrating radar to be used on the Caldwell property. The request had been denied for lack of probable cause. He noted irregularities in thermal scans during the original search, temperature inconsistencies, dead spots in the basement wall, but there was no body. No warrant, no crime, at least not officially. The online forums never stopped talking. A subreddit titled Justice for Lydia grew to over 20,000 members, most of them armchair detectives, screenshotting public records, analyzing property photos, and speculating endlessly. They dissected every image ever posted of Abby's home. Someone even used 3D modeling software to recreate the floor plan based on permit filings and real estate photos. They identified potential hidden spaces, unusual corners in the foundation, and questioned the strange placement of certain vents and beams. One user claimed there was an unaccounted-for gap in the wall space between the laundry area and the back staircase. Another pointed out that basement renovations had been done without a permit a year before Lydia vanished. Still, it was all speculation, no evidence admissible in any courtroom. What made things worse, or maybe more painful, was that the house didn't sell right away. The property sat for months. Despite a competitive housing market, every showing ended the same way. Buyers walked through, hesitated in the basement, then declined to offer. One agent eventually admitted anonymously that potential buyers recognized the address and didn't want the weight of it. Eventually, the listing price dropped, and a family from out of state bought it sight unseen, moving in with no connection to the case at all. Lydia's mother watched from the porch as the new owners arrived. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't knock. She simply stood with her hands on the railing, eyes locked on the side door that once faced the Caldwells' backyard. By then, the case file had grown into a binder 3 inches thick. It contained transcripts, maps, heat scans, and evidence logs, but nothing that could bring Lydia home. The phone calls had stopped, the flyers had faded, the police no longer made statements, and still her room remained untouched, her toothbrush still in the holder, her shoes lined up by the door, as if keeping things in place could hold time still, just long enough for someone, somewhere, to come forward. But they never did. Detective Grayson visited one last time on Lydia's second missing anniversary. He brought with him a thumb drive and a manila folder. Inside were his final notes, unofficial, off-record, but painfully detailed. In the corner of the last page, he'd written a sentence in block letters: "That house has one more secret it hasn't given up yet." He left the folder on the table, said goodbye, and never returned again. The new family painted over the basement, sealed the walls, and remodeled the laundry room. But nothing could erase what people still believed had happened underneath their feet. And behind the stillness of that home, something continued to settle in the silence, waiting. In the spring of 2022, a young couple named Jamie and Lex Reed moved into the blue-trimmed house directly beside the Monroes. They were in their early 30s, recently relocated from Oregon, and drawn to the neighborhood by its affordability and proximity to Jamie's new teaching job. What they hadn't expected was that the house next door, quiet and well-kept with wind chimes on the porch and trimmed hedges out front, had once been the center of a child disappearance case that still haunted the town. They learned about it on their third day in the house, when a neighbor dropped off muffins and warned them to stay away from the Caldwell place if it ever goes up for rent again. Confused, Jamie looked up the address. By nightfall, they had read every article, news clipping, and Reddit thread they could find about Lydia Monroe. It didn't take long before curiosity turned to obsession. The Reeds were already fans of true crime. Jamie had interned at a regional paper, and Lex ran a modest blog about cold cases. Within weeks, they decided to launch a podcast focused exclusively on one story: the disappearance of Lydia Monroe. They named it Buried Beneath and dedicated the first season to reconstructing the events of 2018 from the ground up. They interviewed retired Detective Harold Grayson, got permission from Lydia's mother to reference diary entries, and reached out to residents on Redwood Lane willing to speak. What they uncovered wasn't groundbreaking, but it was enough to stir attention that had long gone silent. Episode 4 changed everything. Titled The Basement That Doesn't Forget, it focused on a report Jamie had found buried in the county's property services database. Specifically, a work order from early 2017 listing a contracted utility inspection on the Caldwell home. It had been completed by a man named Warren Eames, a licensed subcontractor at the time who had entered the crawl space beneath the house to check moisture levels and update duct insulation. The Reeds connected that detail to something odd they'd found in Lydia's case file, a brief mention of a background check during the initial investigation. Eames had been flagged. He was a registered sex offender with a conviction from 2002 involving a minor. He had been interviewed once, denied ever meeting Lydia, and was cleared within 48 hours. But what stood out wasn't the dismissal, it was how little follow-up had been done. The report stated Eames had not been to the Caldwell property since his work was completed in early 2017. But Lex found a neighborhood permit application from May of that year that included a different name, W. Eames, under an air duct cleaning service listed as subcontracted labor on a basement remodel project. The permit was issued to Mike Caldwell, who had hired a third-party firm to perform minor improvements to the lower level. It had never been cross-referenced in the case. The Reeds traced Eames through publicly available records. He had moved twice, currently living 2 counties away, still on probation. Jamie requested access to police interview transcripts through FOIA. The ones they received were heavily redacted, but even through the blacked-out lines, a strange tone came through. Officers had spoken to Eames for only 40 minutes. No follow-up visit to the home was made. No forensic inspection of the crawl space where he had worked was conducted. And perhaps most concerning, no evidence existed that the interior of the basement walls had ever been examined before renovations began. When The Basement That Doesn't Forget aired, it reached over 60,000 downloads within 2 weeks. Lydia's case was back in circulation. Major crime podcasts picked up the story. Hashtags spread across TikTok and Twitter. Reddit threads revived with fresh speculation. People began asking why the crawl space under Abby's old house had never been searched in full. The Reeds used satellite imagery and permit maps to overlay the Caldwell basement structure with schematics from homes built on the same block. They found minor but noticeable differences. Most homes had symmetrical duct runs. The Caldwell basement did not. One side extended 3 feet further toward the utility room wall. That wall, according to old footage, had once been paneled in dark wood before it was replaced during renovations in 2020. The new owners of the house didn't respond to interview requests. According to neighbors, they were aware of the home's history, but had agreed not to speak to media. Lex tried contacting the renovation company listed on the original permit, but the business had closed during the pandemic. No records could be found of what, exactly, had been removed or replaced during the basement project. Still, public pressure mounted. Lydia's mother issued her first public statement in nearly a year, thanking the Reeds for keeping her daughter's name from disappearing. She said she wasn't interested in revenge, only the truth. And she believed that somewhere inside that house, inside its walls or beneath its floor, was the final answer to what had happened the night Lydia didn't come home. Detective Grayson reappeared in the final episode of the Reed season. Now fully retired, he admitted on tape that he believed they had found something real. "I always thought we missed it, and I always thought that house had one more place we hadn't looked." When asked what he meant, he replied simply, "The crawl space. No one ever mapped it properly, and there's more room in there than the blueprints admit." That line became the tagline of the series, and more importantly, it set into motion a chain of renewed questions that would, months later, lead to a discovery behind a wall no one remembered building. But at the time, all anyone could do was listen and wait. The renovation was supposed to be simple, just new drywall, better insulation, maybe a finished floor to turn the cluttered basement into something usable. The new owners of the Caldwell house, a couple in their late 40s who had relocated from out of state, had known vaguely about the home's past. Their realtor had informed them during closing, but they claimed it didn't bother them. The price had been right, and the neighborhood was quiet. They moved in with 2 kids and a Labrador and didn't think much of the whispers they sometimes caught in the grocery store or the way the neighbors politely waved but never introduced themselves. It wasn't until early August of 2023, nearly 5 years after Lydia Monroe disappeared, that the first hammer hit the sheetrock in the basement utility room. It started with a plumbing leak. The utility closet had poor airflow, some signs of mold, and a pipe that had begun to rust through the lower elbow. A contractor friend came to help, and by noon, they had pulled the washer and dryer away from the wall and were prying off panels that had clearly been added years ago. One section fell off, less dense, almost hollow. There were no studs behind it, no anchor screws like the others. It wasn't on the blueprint they'd been given during inspection. Behind it, they discovered a false wall, sealed with mismatched drywall, no paint, and thin layers of adhesive that had begun to flake. When they pulled it off, it came away in one large piece. What was behind it wasn't immediately recognizable. It looked like an old storage niche, maybe 2.5 feet wide, only a foot deep, boxed in with insulation around the top and sealed off from airflow. There were no shelves, no lighting, just an awkward narrow cavity hidden behind where the dryer vent used to run. But what was inside brought everything to a stop. A small pile of fabric rested on the concrete, damp in places, discolored with age. At first they thought it was just trash, but then they saw the duct tape, rolled, bunched in a loose coil, with frayed ends where it had clearly been ripped by hand. The fabric was a child's hoodie, stained. Ripped at the collar, and resting beside it, tilted slightly in the dust, was a single pink sandal, worn, with a Velcro strap, and the faded letters LM drawn in black ink beneath the sole. The homeowner didn't hesitate. They backed out of the room, called the non-emergency police line, and said only that they'd found something behind a wall. Officers arrived in under 15 minutes. By nightfall, the street was cordoned off and crime scene tape wrapped around the house like a memory that had been waiting to resurface. Forensic teams moved in with floodlights and evidence markers. Word spread fast. Lydia Monroe's name was on every tongue again. Reporters circled like birds above a long-dead storm. Inside the cavity, investigators found additional items, 2 more strips of duct tape, one still faintly curled at the edges, and a clump of long, light brown hair stuck to the fabric of the hoodie. A partial zipper, a torn piece of what appeared to be pajama pants, no bones, no body. But everything about the contents aligned with Lydia's last known appearance. The sandal was identical to the pair described by her mother in 2018. The duct tape had pet hair on it, matching the breed of the Caldwell's dog at the time. All of it was immediately sent to the lab. DNA results were ordered with rush priority. The false wall itself was measured and documented. It had been constructed using leftover building materials, different brands of drywall, nails that didn't match the rest of the basement, and a cut-out insulation panel that looked like it had been reused. Forensics determined the structure was likely built shortly after Lydia's disappearance, sometime between March and June of 2018. It had been expertly concealed, flushed tight to the studs, mudded over, then covered with a shelving unit that had since been removed in the 2020 remodel. But the cavity had never been fully cleared. Whoever sealed it either forgot what they left behind or assumed no one would ever find it. Detectives reopened the case immediately. The Monroe family was notified in person. Lydia's mother reportedly collapsed when she saw the evidence. Her father, now remarried and living out of state, flew in the next day. The items were shown to them one by one for confirmation. Her mother needed only a glance at the sandal before nodding and covering her face. "That's hers," she whispered. "She drew those letters herself." Media coverage exploded. The podcast that had once reignited interest in Lydia's case released a bonus episode within hours titled "The Wall That Spoke." Thousands downloaded it within the first day. Every theory, every rumor, every dismissed piece of speculation was now alive again. The original detective, Harold Grayson, was brought back in as a consultant. He toured the basement with current investigators and reportedly whispered only one sentence while standing in front of the hollow space. "It was always here." A fresh search warrant was issued for the entire property. The home was cleared, scanned with ground-penetrating radar, and partially deconstructed under controlled supervision. Nothing else was found, no further cavities, no human remains. But what they had recovered was enough to reopen a dormant file, enough to build a timeline. And enough to confirm what Lydia's mother had always believed, that her daughter hadn't left that house alive, that something had happened in that basement, and now, 5 years later, the house had finally started to speak. The lab results came back in under a week. There was no ambiguity. The hair recovered from the hoodie fibers, the dried skin cells from the duct tape, and trace DNA on the Velcro strap of the pink sandal all belonged to Lydia Monroe. The match was conclusive. 5 years after she vanished from a sleepover less than 100 feet from her own home, forensic science had finally proven what so many had feared. Lydia had never left the Caldwell house. Her body was still missing, but the evidence found inside that sealed wall was no longer considered circumstantial. It was personal, direct, and damning. The timeline was re-examined with precision. Investigators now focused on the days immediately following Lydia's disappearance in 2018. Cell phone data, receipts, digital activity, everything was reviewed again under a harsher lens. It was during this audit that a detail emerged buried in county permit filings. A contractor receipt submitted by Michael Caldwell had been filed 2 days after Lydia was reported missing. The service listed basement insulation replacement and minor framing repair. The payment was made in cash. The business used, a local handyman service, was no longer active. But the name on the invoice was clear, and the signature at the bottom matched Caldwell's driver's license. The Caldwell basement had always been the focal point of speculation, but this receipt shifted it from theory to fact. The original timeline showed that officers had searched the basement within 36 hours of Lydia being reported missing. At that time, they noted the utility room as cluttered but unremarkable. But what they hadn't known was that sometime between that visit and the 4th day, before the deeper forensic scans had even been considered, Michael Caldwell had already altered part of the structure. Investigators now believed that hollow cavity had not existed on the first night of the investigation. It had been constructed after, the insulation removed, framing cut, drywall added, mudded over, and sealed behind furniture. Everything they'd missed hadn't been there yet. It had been created in the panic that followed. Detectives traced down the man who supposedly performed the work. His name was Tony Weller, a self-employed handyman who had worked off books for years before shutting down his operation in 2020. When contacted, Weller initially claimed not to remember the job. But when shown the receipt, he acknowledged doing some patchwork for the Caldwells. He said he was told it was for water damage behind the laundry unit. He remembered being paid in cash and told not to worry about permits. When asked if he had ever questioned the unusual placement of the framing, he hesitated, then added, "I remember thinking it didn't make sense. It was a weird spot to repair." But they said it was just temporary, covering an old vent or something. That was enough to obtain a formal subpoena for Mike Caldwell's financial records, phone logs, and email history from the days surrounding Lydia's disappearance. What they found was careful, almost too clean. His credit card showed no activity for nearly a week. His phone had been powered off for several hours the day after Lydia was reported missing, an anomaly noted by investigators but never pursued. More damning, a deleted email recovered from his backup cloud account showed communication with a friend who worked in contracting. The subject line read, "Need help covering old vent, no permits." The date? March 18, 2018, 2 days after Lydia was last seen alive. When the news broke publicly, the backlash was immediate. The Monroe family held a press conference, standing beside the lead detective who had reopened the case. Lydia's mother, hollowed by grief and years of waiting, spoke with calm fury. "We were told there was no evidence, that nothing pointed to that house, but it was there. It was always there. They just hadn't looked deep enough." Reporters flooded the street again. Abby's name re-entered public speculation, even though she was now legally an adult and had not been seen publicly since her family moved away. The focus remained on her father. Mike Caldwell, once a respected insurance adjuster and neighborhood committee member, was now the target of a full criminal investigation. Search warrants were issued for his new residence out of state. Devices were seized, interviews were reconducted, surveillance was placed on his home. Though there was still no physical evidence of Lydia's death, no body, no recorded cause, prosecutors believed they had enough to establish criminal obstruction and destruction of evidence. For now, they pursued charges related to tampering, false reporting, and interfering with an investigation. More would come, they said, once the full picture was clear. The hidden space behind the wall became a symbol of something far worse than poor police work. It was a reminder of how quickly fear can turn into concealment, and how easily a child can be forgotten when the evidence is just one layer too deep. Investigators stood in the basement for hours after the cavity had been fully exposed, taking new measurements, comparing the dimensions to the official floor plans. One officer reportedly whispered, "He built it to hold something for just long enough, then left it behind. Now that something was public record, now it had a case number, now it had a name. And the man who built the wall would no longer be able to pretend it had never existed." The trial of Michael Caldwell began 7 months after his taped confession. The prosecution didn't have a body. They didn't need one. What they had was stronger, a trail of physical evidence sealed behind a wall, matched DNA, a timeline built down to the hour, and his own words admitting he had found Lydia's body, hidden it, and lied about it for 5 years. He had tried to say it wasn't intentional, that it was a moment of panic. But the jury wasn't deciding guilt based on intention, they were deciding based on truth. And for 5 years, he had buried that. For 5 years, he let an entire community believe a child had vanished into thin air. Lydia's mother sat in the courtroom every day. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't even cry during most of the testimony. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, the same way she had sat across from officers in her living room 5 years earlier, answering questions they already knew had no good answers. Her ex-husband came from out of state to testify. He spoke briefly about Lydia's childhood, her love of birds, how she once nursed a sparrow back to health using eyedroppers and patience. He broke down when asked to identify her handwriting from a page of the diary that had been recovered. It read, "Sometimes I wish I had a secret place no one could find." The courtroom fell silent when the prosecution showed photographs of the hidden wall, the dimensions, the insulation, the crumpled clothes, the sandal. They placed a diagram of the cavity on a projector and showed how it had been built, intentionally, carefully, and in a space designed to be overlooked. The contractor who unknowingly helped frame the enclosure testified with a visibly shaking voice. He said he still hadn't forgiven himself for not asking questions. "It didn't feel right," he said, "but I just took the cash. I just wanted to finish the job." Caldwell sat at the defense table and said nothing. He didn't testify. His lawyers argued for leniency, calling it an accidental death, but their words never matched the reality presented on the screen behind them. It hadn't been an accident once he decided to hide it. It hadn't been panic when he moved her belongings back into place or plugged in the dryer to hide the smell. It hadn't been a mistake when he sealed the drywall, repainted it, and went to sleep. That was intention. That was obstruction. That was silence made permanent. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Lydia's mother was given the chance to speak. She walked to the front with a piece of paper in her hand but didn't read from it. Instead, she spoke from memory. For 5 years, I looked at your house every day and wondered. I asked myself if she was scared, if she was alone, if she was cold. You knew, and you let me beg the world for answers. You could have given her back, but you didn't. Then she turned. Not to the judge, not to the defendant, but to the gallery. Let her name be known for what it is, not a mystery, not a rumor. Lydia Monroe was here, and now the truth is too. The judge sentenced Michael Caldwell to 28 years, 18 for manslaughter, 10 for obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. There was no possibility of parole for at least 20. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers. Just a long silence that settled over the room like something finally exhaled. After the trial, the new homeowners of the Caldwell residence, who had cooperated quietly throughout the investigation, held a small gathering in the basement. They had rebuilt the utility wall with fresh framing, clean drywall, and soft lighting. But before sealing it completely, they placed a small plaque on the inside edge. It read, "In this house, we tell the truth." Then they painted over it, knowing it would remain hidden behind the wall, but never forgotten. Lydia's remains were never fully recovered, but enough evidence was found to allow for a symbolic burial. Her family held a quiet service beneath the old oak tree where she used to read in the summer. Her favorite bird song, a recording of a mourning dove, played from a small speaker while family and close friends stood in silence. Her mother placed the pink sandal on the headstone, then stepped back without a word. The marker read simply, "Lydia Monroe, 2005-2018. The light you gave never left." And in the years that followed, the street changed. New families moved in. The podcast that had reignited the case ended its first season and never produced another. But people remembered. The story of Lydia Monroe remained. It stayed in the way neighbors looked out for one another, in the porch lights that stayed on later than usual, in the way children were called home a little earlier, hugged a little tighter. The basement had given up its secret, and now, finally, so had the silence.